Well, hello, everybody, and welcome. And I'm not going to say a lot about Liora because she's going to tell you a lot about herself, but I am going to say that this is one of my favorite kinds of schmoozes, where we have somebody who I've known since she was like 1.5 or 2. She grew up at Becky along with her siblings. And now she is out in the world doing amazing work that's very important and very challenging. And I was so thrilled that she agreed to come and talk to us about the work she's doing down in Texas to help migrants and immigrants get across the border safely. And I'm going to then turn it right over to Liora and let you tell us your story.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and screen share. Hopefully this works. It's been a while since my law school days when we were all consumed by Zoom. Okay, can everyone see it now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Shoshana and Rachel, for having me. It's good to be here and to share a little bit more with y'all about my work world. So today I'll be talking about immigration at our southern border and some recent barriers to asylum. I'm an immigration attorney down here. I live in San Antonio and work mostly in Laredo. So I'll be talking first, just to give a little roadmap. I'll be talking first about my background, a little bit about my work in the field in various places over the years, some background of asylum law, the connection to the Holocaust, a little bit about my family's personal story and connection to that time. Then talking about the basis of asylum, a little bit about the law, and a little bit about the types of arguments that we make. Then I'll be talking about policy changes under Trump, but just a little because there were a lot of them. And then I'll be going to talk about similar challenges under Biden, and then some of my day-to-day work and some of the changes in the various populations I've been seeing. So to start out, a little bit more about myself for those who don't know me. I am the youngest daughter of Liora Cohen and Stephen Fraade, both here tonight. I was born and raised in New Haven, and I grew up in Westville and went to Becky. And I also really credit the start of my immigration career, or my path, to New Haven, because I first started in the field when I was interning in college for a couple summers with a wonderful organization in New Haven called IRIS, a refugee resettlement organization. And from that, I really wanted to continue doing the work. And I went to college in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which has a pretty similar refugee population to New Haven, slightly different populations, but reminded me of New Haven in a lot of ways. And so I got to intern at an organization and take a bunch of classes on that, and then had the opportunity to take a wonderful asylum clinic my senior year, where we worked on cases of individuals who were detained in a detention center, well, in a jail in York County, Pennsylvania, where they housed folks in ICE detention. And that led me to really want to continue to do the work. I wanted to work with folks who were detained more. And I got the opportunity as a fellow in the Avodah Jewish Service Corps in DC after I graduated undergrad. And there I got to work with a great organization called Care Coalition. And they do a lot of things. They've changed a lot and grown a lot since I've been there. But while I was there, I was mostly working what is called a legal orientation program. And that's providing know your rights presentations and assistance to individuals, pro se individuals who don't have immigration attorneys. And I did that for about 4 years, and then decided I wanted to keep doing the work, but that the best way to do that was to go to law school to get a degree and to be able to provide more zealous representation to folks, because we always need more of that in this field. Then I went on to go to CUNY School of Law, which is a public interest law school in Long Island City, Queens. Great place. Took a great immigration clinic there, had some internships, continued on in the path, and then became a fellow of the Immigrant Justice Corps, which is a 2-year fellowship for recent law graduates all throughout the US, a bunch of placements in New York, but a bunch also in San Antonio. And one of them is Raíces, where I'm placed. which is one of the biggest, or maybe even the biggest, immigration legal services organization in Texas. We have offices all throughout the state. So I live in San Antonio, but I work out of the Laredo office, and I also do some work out of the San Antonio office. So I'll be sharing a little bit more about that fellowship later on. And an interesting fact is that the founder of the IJC Fellowship was Honorable Judge Robert Katzman, who sadly passed away a couple of years ago. But he was Jewish, and he was the son of a refugee who fled Nazi Germany. And on his other side, his other parent was a child to Russian immigrants. So I resonate a lot with his story, and it's been interesting hearing about the reasons he created the fellowship. I think a lot of similar reasons that we'll be talking about today. Oh, and I forgot to mention, feel free to ask questions throughout. I think we'll also have some time at the end, but feel free to jump in at the end of a slide or in the middle of a slide. So first, I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about the background of asylum law. Some of y'all might know this, some of it might be a little bit new, and then also talking about my family's personal history, which goes along with a lot of this history of asylum law. So around the time of the Holocaust, there was a quota system in place, and there are a number of acts, one of them the Johnson-Reed Act, and that set lower quotas for immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, and then it favored England and Northern Europe, and it made it harder for folks, especially Jews, to get out of Europe during the Holocaust and prior to it. And my family, I have a bit of a family history that goes along the lines of these quota acts. So my father's mother was born in Berlin, Germany, and her two parents fled Germany during the Holocaust. I believe it was in like 1937. We think it was a bit before Kristallnacht. And so my grandfather was put in jail for being a Czech Jew. And as soon as he got out, they fled. They saw it was only going to get worse. And they had the opportunity to flee. And he was able to get them quotas under the Czech quotas because he had dual citizenship for Czech and German. And so he was able to get out, and his wife was, and they went ahead. And then my grandmother followed along behind with her grandmother. And they went throughout Europe. They went to Amsterdam, Paris, France, southern France, kind of, with the Nazis in their wake. And they tried to get my grandmother's grandmother a visa, but couldn't get one. They couldn't get one under the German one. They were at that point too far gone, or they weren't issuing them anymore. And so my grandmother was able to come to the US, but her grandmother wasn't, and ended up dying during the Holocaust. Years later, we found out in Auschwitz. So I think of the quota system as, in a way, like some of my family members were able to get out through it, but mostly through the lack of the Czech quota, whereas, the German quota let them down like it did many other people. Another example, a common example of how the immigration system at that time failed refugees is the SS St. Louis, or I think also known as the MS St. Louis. And it was a ship of German Jews that was turned away. It was supposed to arrive to Cuba and the US, and both Cuba and the US turned the ship away, and it was forced to return to Europe, where many of its passengers died during the Holocaust. And I bring this up because I'm going to make a bit of a comparison to both the quota system and that ship at a later point, but I think they're also important parts of the history and why asylum law came to be. So the 1951 convention was drafted by the US in response to large migrations of people following World War II and the Holocaust. And this set the standard for what a refugee was, but it only applied to events from before 1951. So then the 1967 protocol went ahead and expanded it to include future refugees in that definition. And then the 1980 Refugee Act established the definition of a refugee, which really established the core tenets of asylum law. I'll be talking about that a bit on the next page. There's a lot more immigration history, a lot that I don't know, a lot that I've learned over the years or in law school. So for anyone who's looking for a better read or more of the history on specifically our country's connection to it and its laws, I highly recommend No Justice in the Shadows, How America Criminalizes Immigrants by Lena Das. She's a wonderful advocate and a director of the NYU Immigration Clinic. And she also provides a really helpful and important reference or framework of how the policies in the past and present were racist in both how they were made and how they were carried out. Any questions on stuff before I go into more on the 1980 Refugee Act definition and standard? Okay, great. Feel free to jump in if there are. So the 1980 Refugee Act established the definition of a refugee. And this is the language I included on the screen is language I use in all of my briefs in my Know Your Rights presentations. If you meet an immigration lawyer, they can kind of like rattle this off to you by heart, just because it's such a vital part of the work. So I'll go ahead and read through, not the whole thing, but I'll read through the important parts and insert just a little bit of language that's more applicable that I use in my cases, and that's applicable to the asylum standard today. So a refugee is a person who is unable or unwilling to return to their home country, or they're unable or unwilling to avail themselves of the protection of that country because of some type of past persecution or a well-founded fear of future persecution on account of 5 different grounds. The grounds are race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, and lastly, political opinion. And the biggest development, at least in my opinion, or understanding of the law in asylum law over the years has been what we call the PSGs, which stands for particular social group. We use a lot of acronyms in immigration, too many, so I'm trying to break them down, but if I forget any point, please feel free to let me know or ask. So the PSG examples, I just included a short amount of examples, both ones that are still super relevant, others that were maybe more historical, and I'll kind of go through and read those and explain a bit. So sexual orientation is a pretty common one, gender identity, women unable to leave a relationship, often because of some type of DV in a relationship, domestic violence, and persecution because of relationship to a family member. And this past one, I can kind of give a bit of an example. We see it across countries, but I used to see it a lot in Central America, where say there might be one person, so say like I'm the person who's applying for asylum. So I have a sibling and gang members tried to get my sibling to join the gangs. My sibling says, no, I'm against this. I won't join your gangs. The gang members then try to harm my sibling. So my sibling then has a basis for asylum, but then the gang members go after me and try to harm me just because of my relationship to my sibling. Then I now have a basis for asylum just because I'm related to them. So it comes up in a lot of ways, not just gang members and trying to get people to join gangs, but that is a common one we see. And to also give a little bit more background of what a PSG is, it's been frequently described as a group of persons who share a common immutable characteristic, and the members of that group cannot or should not be required to change that characteristic. So there's always room for arguing for new types of groups. During Trump, there was a pretty big attack by Sessions on a couple of the groups, including the women unable to leave a relationship, the domestic violence claims, and also the family-based ones. Now, attorneys still found ways to kind of argue around it by fitting people into other groups. A lot of the time people can fit both of those groups sometimes into political opinion by arguing that someone's opinion to not join the gangs or someone's opinion to try to, leave a relationship that surmounts to a political opinion. Another interesting or noteworthy point about both the particular social groups and just all of these categories for asylum is that it can be pretty dependent on the circuit court that the person falls into. So for example, in Connecticut, we're part of the Second Circuit. New York, when I was in Vermont, I also practiced under that. And the Second Circuit is generally seem to be one of the better circuits. There's just more arguments to be made around the particular social group. Sometimes also like what might constitute past persecution. That could be an area that could change a little bit depending on the circuit. So in Texas, I'm under the Fifth Circuit, which is not one of the better circuits. We have our challenges in many ways. And when I was in DC, we were, I think that was the Fourth Circuit. And that one was pretty good. The Ninth Circuit is also another one that constitutes of California and around that area. That is also a good circuit. So that can impact an asylum case. It can also be impacted by country conditions. So for example, in sexual orientation claims, we see this a lot, that depending on the country, it could be a stronger or weaker argument. So going back to Central America again, a lot of the time judges and prosecutors, if someone brings a sexual orientation claim out of Mexico, they're going to have more issues with it. And they're going to say, oh no, Mexico is like so progressive. They have pride. You're not going to be persecuted there. And it's definitely still worth arguing it. I have a friend who recently won one of these cases. There are plenty of LGBT cases out of Mexico that win, but it does tend to be a little bit harder than, say, a person who's out of like El Salvador or Honduras, where the country conditions just tend to be a little bit more strong. So that can apply to all different areas for the basis of asylum, not just sexual orientation.
Super quick question, Liora.
Yeah.
The differences in the circuits, I mean, these are federal courts, and so why are there are these regional differences? Like who gets to be a judge in these places, and why would Texas necessarily be worse? I mean,
Yeah, good question. I'll try to answer this. If anyone else on the call has more background than me, please feel free to jump in, because I learned a little bit about this, but probably not as much as I would like to know. So immigration law, it's technically administrative law, and it's federal in the sense that you can practice anywhere in the US. You don't have to have like a specific bar membership of that state. But then the immigration courts themselves are out of cities, so they have judges who are, within those courts. Because they're administrative judges, they're not technically judges, which we don't always remind them of it, but we like to talk about it amongst ourselves. I know people who won't like to, say honorable or judge, to kind of push back against that. So my understanding is it's like pretty easy for people to become judges. They've had a lot of new judges over the last couple of years. I remember at one point, one of them was a clown in his other gig. And that was everyone in the immigration world was like, oh, yeah, they let in a clown. So it sometimes is kind of random. A lot of the time we see people who were either like private immigration attorneys. Those generally tend to be better. We see a lot of people who were prosecutors for DHS who become judges. And then I feel like there's also a lot of people overlap between that and the military. Like I'll see folks who are judges in military courts. So it's kind of all over the place. And then, sorry, going back to your question, where the circuit court comes in is that when you appeal a decision from an immigration judge, it goes to a specific body called the Board of Immigration Appeals. And that's like just an immigration group of a board of judges, and they make decisions. But if someone appeals from that, then it goes to the circuit court. And so that's why the circuit decisions are a little bit more specific, because they'll have, in certain circuits, they'll say, oh yeah, we don't want to hold that this type of, group constitutes a particular social group. I don't know so much more of the background and history, but that's why those circuit groups are kind of different. And then I guess technically they could go up to the Supreme Court on stuff as well. But yeah, if anyone else in the audience has better explanation, please feel free to jump in, because that's very, very cursory.
Aren't circuit judges appointed within their region, which then would reflect the political stance of the area?
I think so. That sounds right to me. I mean, I've seen, I guess actually most of the judges I know are immigration judges. So yeah, that That sounds right to me. Thank you. That's a helpful addition. Anything else? Any other questions on that or additional tidbits that folks have? Okay, great. So moving on, I'm just going to go over very quickly the definition of an asylee, just because we went over the definition of a refugee, and this will be very important on the slides that I go over, both for policies under Trump and Biden, because there's been some pretty concerning past proposed rules or past rules and then current proposed rules. So an asylee is a person who meets the definition of a refugee, but they're already present in the United States, or they're seeking admission at a port of entry. So a port of entry is a point along the border where someone can present themselves to immigration officials, and they'll have CBP, which is Customs and Border Patrol officials there, and they'll usually have a bridge between the city on the Mexico side and on the other side. So where I work, it's Laredo is on the Texas side, and then Nuevo Laredo is on the Mexican side, and that's a port of entry. So folks can present themselves there and request asylum. But an important part of the right to asylum is that a person can request it from within the US. So some examples of this, if a person came to the US on a visa and overstayed their visa, even if they were here with what we call unlawful presence, like without a visa or anything, they could still request asylum. They wouldn't have to like leave the US and come back. Also, folks who cross the border without documentation, without like authorization or inspection from immigration, they can also request asylum. Sometimes they may or may not be put into detention. I think it depends a little bit on the administration, a little bit just on location. It can feel a little random, but those folks, they can usually get released from detention to fight their case. And sometimes when they're not able to get out on something called parole, they have to fight their case from detention, but they never have to like leave the US just because they crossed over without permission. So then just the last thing on this slide, I have a quote from Hannah Arendt that I just like to include because I think it really highlights the importance of asylum as a human right, and something that I try to kind of think about and have my work practice follow in. So I'll go ahead and read it for folks who don't have a visual. The right to have rights, or the right of every individual to belong to humanity, should be guaranteed by humanity itself. And she wrote this in 1951. She had a lot of philosophical writings that I've seen when looking in the history of the creation of asylum law following the Holocaust. And she was a Jewish refugee. Any questions before we go on to some of the policy changes under Trump? So I might not go through all of these. And a note, there were many more policy changes. There was like more than 400. The ones that I have on this page are ones that impacted the type of work that I used to do and that I currently do, which is primarily with folks who are what we call in removal proceedings, which is really just immigration court proceedings. So folks who have hearings before a judge and have to apply for some type of relief like asylum or another type of relief because they've lived here for a long time. And if they don't win, then they're deported. So that's kind of what this applies to. There are a lot of other policy changes that had to do with visa petitions and kind of that whole other side of immigration law, which is under what's called USCIS. So the first one I'll talk about is the transit ban. All of these are really problematic. Yeah, every single one of them. So I might say it for all of them, but if I don't say it for one of them, just a disclaimer, all of them were. The transit ban it prevented migrants from applying for asylum if they traveled through another country before reaching the US, and then if they hadn't applied in that previous country. Now it's just so problematic because so many people applying for US at the border have traveled through other countries, like unless they're from Mexico, they would have traveled through another country. So it discriminates against folks from Central and South America But there's also a lot of folks from other continents who in the past and recently have traveled through to arrive at the border. Haitians did that in really large numbers, Cameroonians, we see this again and again. I heard about it a little bit with Ukrainians, but I think they were a group that my understanding is that happened less. So it's just also a less privileged group of folks who can't, have a visa and like fly into the US. The next one was a metering turn back policy. There are a bunch of different asylum bans under Trump. So this was the second one. And this one, asylum seekers could only seek asylum at the port of entry. So at that border area with the immigration officials. And they could only do it if they sought, if they sought entry elsewhere, and then they were turned back to Mexico and placed an official wait list to present themselves. So if they didn't present themselves at that port of entry, it was basically like, okay, you have to go wait in Mexico. And that also, I think there was a lot of confusion about the wait lists and like very little information on it. So just also a chaotic system where it's hard to preserve rights that are already being infringed upon. The next one is a pretty big one, Title 42. I may refer to this one as the COVID one as a shorthand. And this one prevented folks from entering the US under a public health rule. It basically weaponized COVID-19 and it authorized Customs and Border Patrol officials to expel arriving migrants without screening them for asylum, which is normally what they would have to do. There were certain countries that were exempt under Title 42 under Trump, and then some differences under Biden. And this one was really upsetting as someone who was living in Texas during this iteration under Biden, but still under Title 42. So frustrating to see our governor like use this and weaponize COVID to keep people out. Meanwhile, like he's not doing anything else to protect folks from COVID. So it always felt very obvious to me that folks were just using it for that, but was very frustrating. And the next one is also the other big one, which is called MPP, Migrant Protection Protocols. Don't be fooled by the name protection. There was basically zero government protection involved. I'll also refer to this one as Remain in Mexico. That's a common used name just because it kind of is what it sounds like. They basically made people wait in Mexico in between their hearings. Normally folks would come into the US, they would, probably be in CBP custody for maybe a couple hours, a couple days, maybe immigration detention a couple weeks. And then if they get released, they have the rest of their hearings in immigration courts. So this was, they had to wait in Mexico in between, and then they had their immigration court hearings in tent courts in various border cities. So they had like 7 different ones. Laredo, where I work, is one of them. And in a couple slides, I'll show a picture of the tent court. So this one was really awful. I'll talk about it more in the next couple slides when I talk about the work I did, because I represented a lot of people under this. But it was just really awful. It was known for putting folks in really dangerous and vulnerable situations. Folks were waiting in, various parts of Mexico in shelters, but a lot of the time there wasn't space in the shelters, and folks were just waiting and often didn't have a way, to safely make money. And so it was really common to hear about folks getting kidnapped, robbed, extorted. I think like every single person I met under this program had gotten robbed or extorted at some point. The next one is family separation. I won't talk about that a bunch because I don't have a ton of experience under it. And it was also in the news a lot at that time. For the expanded enforcement priorities, I won't talk a bunch about this, but the general idea was that Trump was making it easier to put folks in immigration proceedings, making it easier to put folks in detention specifically. Every administration has like a set of priorities, and his were pretty low. The other areas are basically just that he kind of made it easier as well to put folks who had been placed out of immigration proceedings back into it. Sometimes there are folks who they might be able to get a visa, but they can't get the visa from the immigration court. The judge doesn't have jurisdiction, so they have to go to another immigration entity called USCIS. to get it, but often some of those visas may take years. There's one visa called a U visa, where it's a person who's a victim of a violent crime, and if they've made a police report, they may be able to get that certified and get a U visa, but that process takes a long time. Last I heard it was 5 years, but I think it's longer. I have a client who's been waiting, I think, for like 7 years. So closing people's cases is a way to make sure folks don't get deported while they try to get those visas. And Trump reopened a lot of those cases and deported people, and then also stopped the process of being able to close those cases. Questions on Trump policies before we move on to Biden? So there's a lot of similar challenges under Biden. Some of this might be a little bit of kind of repeat, but I do want to highlight how some of the policies are very similar. Now, a caveat that a lot of the policies on the last page, I think every single one of those policies was litigated in federal court. Some of them are still being litigated. A lot of them have gone kind of back and forth. Some of that resulted in them being started up again, which we'll talk about on this page, with a couple policies that had to restart under Biden or couldn't end under Biden. So I do just want to say, folks were putting a lot of time, a lot of work into litigating issues. But what I do want to highlight here also is that there's certain steps Biden took that he didn't need to take under that litigation, that really went to just have more people impacted negatively. So the first one, MPP, Remain in Mexico 2.0, this one started in December 2021. And this was the one that I worked under while I was at Raice's. So I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next page. But the gist of this is that the federal court forced the restart of the program, but Biden chose to expand the program, and he chose to expand including the Western Hemisphere. So where we saw this really impacted was including Haitians and other Caribbean nationals who previously might have been exempt under Trump's MPP. One of the good things, which I'll talk about on the next slide, is there were more exemptions than MPP 1.0, which is there were more ways to get folks out of the program and into the US. And something else that I wanted to highlight is that SCOTUS did end MPP in June 2021. But my experience being on the ground, it really felt like Biden was kind of like dragging his feet. Some of that, my understanding is it might have been because of an injunction and, certain things happening in court, but it still felt really frustrating that he was enrolling new people in the program. Folks didn't have a lot of information, and folks were still being made to show up to their hearings, and some of them deported even after the order ended. So there was just some frustration on the ground that felt like he wasn't really trying to prioritize it ending. Whether that was due to, rules under the federal orders, that's another issue I don't know a ton about, but just what it felt like on the ground. Next, Title 42 was also expanded under Biden. So similarly, he was prohibited from ending Title 42 because of a court order, but it didn't require a reference expanding the policy, which is something he also did for Title 42. This was the one where folks couldn't get in because of the COVID health order. And so moving on to the most recent one is a proposed rule that I think he first started talking about in January. So some of y'all might have heard of it. It's supposed to go into effect when Title 42 is lifted, May 11th, 2023, when COVID isn't going to be considered as an ongoing health emergency to prevent migrants in this way. There are a lot of really concerning parts of the proposed rule. Full disclosure, I have not had time to read the full rule because it's been a busy couple months. So this is based on a lot of different practice advisories and things I've been hearing from folks on the ground and within the organization as well. So some of these elements, the first one is a narrow parole program for people from Cuba, Haiti, and Nicaragua. And this is similar. There was a program that was put in place in October 22. So it was after MPP had been ended, Venezuelans had been subject to MPP. So I had them as clients. We were trying to get folks in to the US who were stuck and remain in Mexico. But then after it ended, Biden initiated this program, a parole program for Venezuelans, so that they could enter through that. And it was kind of framed by him as, oh, this is like another way. This is how I'm going to address all of these people, all of these Venezuelans. But one of the frustrations that advocates have had on the ground, there's some statistics here, just to give an idea. So there was only like 11,400 Venezuelans who were able to enter the US through this parole program, through this humanitarian parole program since October 2022, when it was made. There's 34,000 Venezuelans who were processed or expelled at the border in September 2022 alone. So still, while I think MPP might have still been going at that point, I can't remember if they were bringing new people in or not. But to say that, you know, the parole program, at least as we've seen it so far for the Venezuelans, was not addressing the vast numbers of people who are trying to get in the US. And another issue with types of parole programs like that is, you know, there's more requirements. Sometimes folks, you know, have to figure out what types of documents they need. Do they need a sponsor? Do they need to have like their passport, other types of documents? Everyone might not be eligible. In the past, some of these humanitarian parole programs is only for folks who might have some type of like humanitarian issue. So if they have a medical issue or family members do. So there's just been a lot of confusion, and it hasn't felt like it's really addressed the issue as it should. And I do want to make a really quick analogy. The parole program has a quota of 30,000 people per month, and that is across Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, and Venezuelan folks who are trying to get in. So when I first heard about the quota, it naturally reminded me of the quota that they had, you know, back in the Holocaust, but my family members were trying to get out. So it's frustrating to see something be done like that again. We've seen how in the past quotas do not help nearly enough people. And I think for similar reasons where the numbers aren't high up enough, but then also immigration officials aren't able to even process that number of people a lot, or their system is so chaotic that, yeah, not the full number of people make it through. The next thing I want to talk about the proposed rule is there's a phone application called the CBP One app. And this is an app that's also been in place for a while, but they started expanding their use of it recently. And it's also under the proposed rule to continue its expansion. And the issue with this app, from what I've heard from folks on the ground, is that so the app collects biometrics data for migrants before arriving to the border. It has like face recognition software. They have to take a picture. They have to answer a bunch of other stuff. And then it requires them to make an appointment to seek asylum. So there's been a lot of issues. I've heard that folks need to have a smartphone to use it, that they have to have internet. Originally, it was only in Spanish and English. They added Haitian Creole, but I heard that it wasn't good, that it seemed like it was just like Google Translate, that it wasn't translating properly, that once they got to a later page, there are reports that the translation is not happening throughout the app. So for folks who don't speak that language, that's a barrier. For folks who are staying in shelters, sometimes they have to leave their shelters to have internet. So that puts folks in a more vulnerable situation where they're being kind of like funneled out to other points, which makes them more vulnerable to get, you know, kidnapped or robbed or extorted or whatnot. So those are some of the challenges with the CBP One app. And it's also just frustrating because under asylum, the right to asylum doesn't include that someone has to make an appointment. Like that's never been part of it. And so now adding this other layer just makes it so much harder for people to access. It's a barrier for folks. The next one is the revamping of Trump's transit ban. And this one bars people from asylum, or we think it will bar people from asylum if they enter the US without inspection or authorization before a port of entry. So if someone just like crosses over the border without going to that port of entry, they would be barred from asylum. They could also be barred from asylum if they don't seek protection in the other countries they traveled along and then present themselves at a port of entry. There were notes that if someone had tried to request asylum at those other countries and they weren't able to, that, then they would be able to get in, or if they presented themselves at a port of entry and they can explain why they couldn't make an appointment on that CBP1 app, that they could get in. But there's very little information about like what they would have to show, how they would have to show they had issues. And with the vast number of people having issues, it's unclear, like, would that be an effective exemption? Would they actually be able to process people in that way? And then expanding expedited removal. I won't go into that one a ton because I want to leave some more time for questions. But this is basically, there's another process in immigration where folks don't necessarily go before an immigration judge in their asylum case. It's left up to an asylum officer if they like have a credible fear of persecution. And so there's an interview, and if they pass the interview, then they can go forth. But if they don't, it's a really hard process that doesn't make it easy to appeal. There's not a lot of due process. There's not a lot of representation for folks in these interviews. So just to say kind of that possibility of expanding that type of process in immigration would just lead to way less due process, really just kind of fast tracking folks for deportation if the asylum officers, don't think their claim is strong enough. Oh, sorry. Jumped forward a bit. Sorry, technical, there we go. So some other things that have been on the radar is Biden made an announcement recently. He's considering opening up back family detention centers, which is just awful and heartbreaking. There was one out of Pennsylvania that finally closed recently that folks have been fighting for years and years and years. I mean, definitely since when I was in school in Pennsylvania and working in that area. So the idea that he would then open these back up when there's been so many reports and so many accounts of how these centers are harmful and traumatic for families is very concerning. Another note I just want to say is that family separation has been and is still happening. It might not be exactly in the same way it was happening under Trump, but one of the things about a lot of these different policies under Trump and Biden, so the transit bar ban, the COVID ban, remain in Mexico, a lot of them didn't apply to unaccompanied minors, which are just minors who were arriving to the border without their parents. And, that was good. And there are advocates who I think also litigated to make sure that it didn't apply to the minors. But then it puts family members, or I've heard that it puts, their parents in a hard situation where it's like, do I have my child with me in Mexico in these unsafe conditions? Or do I, have them have their best chance of trying to enter the US and get asylum? So just to say that there's many different types of family separation, and a lot of these policies, I think, enhanced it or put folks in situations that they didn't really have choices to make. And then harmful language, I'll kind of just gloss over that, but I think there's always been some harmful language in the media, both under Trump and Biden, where, folks trying to request asylum at the border are called illegal immigrants. They're requesting asylum under the law. My opinion has always been there's nothing illegal about that. And then just other words that kind of highlight the vast number of people there and placing it kind of on the migrants and not, well, there's lots of people here because under Trump and Biden, we've been making people wait here. And then there's situations in their home countries where more folks are arriving. Okay, sorry, I'm running low on time. I want to finish soon to do questions. How am I on time, Shoshana and Rachel? Should I wrap it up for questions?
It's 8:19. So yeah, if you we can, I would say maybe another 5 minutes and then questions.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, that's great. This is my last slide. So this, I just wanted to talk a little bit about my work as an immigration attorney, some of the different populations I've been working with, how the funding can often change with a lot of these different policy changes. And so I think this applies to not just folks on the border, but we see this a lot at the border too, where funding is often changing. So when I first started at my fellowship, I was working in detention, or I was working with folks in detention in Laredo and folks who had proceedings before the immigration court, and we were just representing whoever we could. That was kind of our model. We couldn't represent everyone, so we did what we could. Then when Remain in Mexico came back for the second time in 2021, the end of 2021, we got funding to run what's called an immigration court help desk for Remain in Mexico, which is where we provided know your rights presentations to folks, and we reviewed applications and helped people submit stuff, but without representing them. We also did represent folks in the program. It was mostly to get folks out of the program through exemption requests. So some of the most common ones we saw were for folks who were LGBT. That was like a pretty easy way to get folks out. Medical requests. The medical requests were pretty easy at the beginning, but one of the issues under Remain in Mexico is there was a lot of control that CBP, that Customs and Border Patrol had. And so they would change the way that we had to submit the exemption requests many times. At first, we didn't need that much information. Then at one point, it seemed like there was like a board in Washington who was reviewing the medical requests. It was just very hard to get information, and it was hard. There wasn't always like a very clear standard. So that was frustrating. We were able to get all of the folks we represented out of the program. I had a client who got very close to going to trial. It was like an hour before, all because CBP wouldn't release her after her request had been granted. Luckily, she got out. Everything was fine. But that's kind of an example of what happens in these types of programs when CBP has a lot of authority. Folks can be in CBP custody and not really be able to contact their lawyers. The lawyers have a hard time trying to figure out who to get in contact with at CBP. CBP doesn't tell us information that they should. So when looking at the proposed rule, I got a lot of flashbacks to MPP, and I'm just very concerned about ways that those, proposed policies could give more power to Customs and Border Patrol and just have more folks waiting in Mexico. And then very quickly, what I'm doing now is we're representing folks before the Laredo Immigration Court, but non-detained. So I'm representing a lot of folks who are longtime residents of Laredo, and we're trying to close their cases so that they can apply for visas, like I mentioned earlier, or we're trying to apply for relief against deportation because they've lived here for a while and have family members. And we argue they would suffer some type of hardship if they were deported. And later in the year, we're going to go back to representing folks in detention, similar work that I was doing when I was with Care Coalition. So always changing down here. There's a lot of folks that need attorneys in Laredo, a lot of folks that need attorneys in detention. We're like one of the main service providers down here. So I think it'll be good to go back to detention and try to support those folks.
Liora, can you just describe the photos at the bottom of the slide?
Yes, because I mentioned I would come to these photos at one point. So the one on the right this is the Laredo tent court. It was kind of just like a giant parking lot by the border with, tent court, like tent buildings, so many officials. It was just mind-boggling to think about like how much taxpayer money they're putting into that atrocity. The middle one is a picture of a private detention center called, so there's a private company called Core Civic, and they run most of the detention centers down here. So the government contracts out to these providers, and then they basically make money off of folks being detained. And then the one to the left is a picture of an immigration court. And that's it. So if folks have questions, thoughts,
I guess I would love to know, I'm sure you have good days and bad days. As far as, days where you really feel like you're getting something done to help people, that would be a good day. And then days where it feels like you're running into roadblocks everywhere you go. And I'm sure you're not alone in that. So how do you and your other colleagues, get up and go and keep doing the work, even when you're really slogging through some rough days?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think part of it is the work community. That's been kind of harder. I'm mostly remote. So my team is mostly in another city, and Raíces is just mostly remote at this point. So that makes it a little bit harder. But I think also I have a really good support system of friends in other cities who do immigration law. So, confidential venting to people in other
Mhm.
organizations, venting to folks within the organization. And then sharing wins is really big. We don't always have a ton of wins. And so sharing them is also a really good way. So, maybe I lost a case last week, but I had a colleague who won, and that's going to kind of like boost me up a little bit.
Nice. Joanne or Rob, you have a question?
Yeah, Liora, about what percentage of applicants for asylum get representation?
That is a good question. Oh, I wish I had the statistic. I've definitely read it. It's not, I think it's pretty low. And then I think it is even lower for folks who are in detention. But that's one of the issues with immigration. In some cities, they have universal representation programs where they try to represent everyone in detention. New York has that. I think when I left DC, they were moving towards that. I don't know if they got as far as New York, but they got pretty close. I don't know of any other models that represent. Most of the ones I know of that do that, it's for folks who are detained. But yeah, sorry, I wish I had the number, but a lot of folks are not represented. And I think that number is heightened when we're talking detention. I think maybe more than 50% aren't represented, but I might just be making up numbers here, so I don't know.
Or you can, if you want to stop sharing your screen, that way
Oh,
make
yes.
it, yes, easier. And then Rabbi, you have a question?
Yeah, so first, wow, thank you so much for well, not just for sharing, but also for just doing this work, which is so important, and really wonderful to hear about this. So thank you. Even if it's wonderful and like upsetting at the same time. And it's like coincidentally yesterday, I joined, or I started this TRUA, which is a sort of Jewish social justice organization. They started a new immigration community of practice for some rabbis. And so I was on that Zoom yesterday, and they were talking about the sort of how disappointed they are in the Biden administration's pushing of this new rule, which is just going to have so much effect. And, they asked us if we could write comments on the bill, and do that stuff. But one thing that really struck me in language that I hadn't seen before, but that I found very moving, is they talked about the idea of migration as a human right. And it was really helpful for me because I think I've had a sense of this for a while, but I don't think I've ever had the sort of awareness to phrase it that way. And I hear so often about how many immigrants at the border are often speaking, like Spanish is often a second language for them, right? They're often speaking like Yucatec Mayan or other language, sort of indigenous languages, and how our country post dates, and our country and the border there post dates a reality in the area that we are now subtly enforcing things on. And the ability to sort of migrate up and down the coast is something that should be, Tamar, give me a second, should be sort of open. And I think that's morally important. And so I just, I'm thinking, I don't know, I'm just really inspired by everything you were sharing. And I guess this is more of a comment than a question, but like, I just think it's so important to allow people to migrate into sort of make the choices that it makes sense for them on land that our country stole from them. And it's just wonderful to see you really doing this like really, really deeply important work. So thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Yeah, I love the like free borders, free migration movement. I can only do my work because I believe in that, and I can only do it because I believe in prison abolition. I don't know I'm going to see either of those in my lifetime, but it's really important. And to another note, I totally forgot about this, but I have a link in the PowerPoint if folks want to write comments. There's an organization that put out a really great toolkit. So for anyone who wants to write comments, you can write one up until March 27th. So thank you for reminding me of that, Rabbi, because I had totally forgotten to share that with y'all.
And then there are some people up here on a screen who have, somebody has a question. Is it Steve or Ellen? Be nice.
Yeah. Can you talk a little more, Sean, about how you communicate with Liora? Oh, sorry.
Liora.
Can you say a little something, Liora, about how you communicate with your clients? Is it both in terms of language, but also in terms of the media? From what you said, I assume not everybody has a cell phone or a smartphone. So, I mean, basic to the work you're doing is being able to talk to your clients. And it's not clear to me what context, and I know you've done a lot of work learning Spanish, but you're certainly not, I assume we're not fluent, and you're dealing with different types of different dialects of Spanish.
Yeah, so to answer this question and also Donna Levine's question, if I speak Spanish, I do speak Spanish. I learned it in like high school and middle school, so very limited, and most of it I've learned on the job. And I went and I did a Spanish immersion program in between law school and working for about 2 months. That really helped. So I'm always working for that. I'm not fluent, but I do speak with all of my clients in it, and I'm at the point, I like to describe myself, I think I'm at the point where I'm proficient or advanced. But I have clients who Spanish isn't their first language, like Rabbi was talking about. And in terms of communication with folks, it really depends on where they are. So with folks in detention, that's its own whole system where you're just at the whims of the jail. Some of them will let you get on calls. I had a recent client, they would only do 30-minute calls, and they said they could do an hour. And like every day for a week, I was like, can you please make this an hour? They just didn't. So I had to go visit them. So it's a lot of, for folks who are detained, video calls, phone calls, visiting folks in person. For folks who are stuck in Mexico, it was a lot of like WhatsApp calls. And folks, some folks did have iPhones, but also people would like get their stuff stolen and they get a new number. And so we'd always give people our numbers on paper so that if something happened to their phone, they could reach us. I do a lot of WhatsApp messages. I love being able to message people because I can see what I said. Recently, I've gotten a lot of clients send voice memos. I think that might just be something that everyone does now, and I have an old soul, so I don't do it, but I get a lot of voice memos now. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
John has a question.
Liora, part of what I'm hearing is you're on the front lines trying to help people who are seeking asylum, but there's not a political will inside the US to spend the money that we would need to spend to actually have people to simply process all the asylum seekers in a timely way, let alone to help settle them, once they get here. So I wonder, can you tell us, are there organizations that you know of that you think are doing a good job of sort of raising awareness and getting people, voters, sort of excited about doing more for immigrants, doing more for refugees, doing more for asylees? Because without that, then even my favorite president, Biden, has, doesn't have, okay, my second favorite president, doesn't have the political support that he needs to sort of, spend the money to solve the problem and actually bring people in a humane way.
That is such a good question. And there's so many good organizations. I'm trying to think. So I think a lot of like legal service organizations do that, but it's not their main focus.
Right.
I mean, I think United We Dream does a good job. That's
Mm.
often more related to, folks with DACA, but also a lot of the time parents. Trying to think other organizations. I don't know as many that do as much voting stuff. I'm sure there are, and I'm just drawing a bit of a blank. But a lot of legal services organizations, Raíces has done, I think, more of that work in the last couple of years as they got more funding and more capacity for that. So I think some of the bigger organizations do that. I know of New York organizations that do a really good job of that, and like local voting and know your rights on local is a great organization that kind of does a lot of that engagement just past
Right.
the law. But
Or
overall,
even if, maybe I'll go to Rabbi Eric for a second. Are there Jewish organizations that are working to expand awareness of this problem and political support for the money we need to pay for it, just to help address this?
Trua does a lot this way. Trua is very involved with this, and so that's usually what I would say. I think Highest does this as well, but beyond Trua and Highest, I'm sure there are others, but I give to Raíces because
Got it.
I like them.
thank you. Yeah. Never Again Action is a good one. They do a lot that has to do with deportations. They do a lot of like protest stuff where they try to stop deportations. But I think they also do some more organizing stuff. I think they've been doing a lot of like posts and emails and calls about folks doing comments. So yeah, a lot of the legal organizations will do stuff about comments. And I think also when there's elections, they'll also do that.
Thank you.
There's a question from the chat that is kind of related, from Tony Davis. Are there any real heroes in the Biden administration with respect to your work? Are there people that we should know about who are really doing a lot?
That's a good question. I mean, there might be, I don't know of them. I don't love Mayorkas. I feel like most of the public figures that I know about are, not great. I mean, I have issue with, I have issue with Kamala Harris. I have issue with Biden. I have an issue with a lot of people who have really bad histories too with immigration stuff and made a lot of promises about this in an administration that I have not been seeing at all, like anywhere near met. There was a meme that was going viral in the immigration world where it was someone saying like, we asked for like DACA, we asked for like folks to be let in, and instead Biden said, oh, maybe we'll open up family separation. So that's what it feels like a lot of the time is we're asking for things and they're not doing that, and then they're just doing things Trump said. So maybe there are, I just don't know about them.
And Lyndon, you have been waiting very patiently.
Thank you. Well, Liora, actually, that was a perfect segue. When you're talking about family separation, what's going on with kids who are being separated or children who are coming in unaccompanied?
Yeah, so I'll speak as much to this as I can. I don't know a ton about it because I mostly work with adults. Raíces does a lot of work with kids and did a lot of work during family separation. So my understanding of the process of folks who come in unaccompanied is they go into what's called like ORR custody. So it's basically like detention centers for kids. And then they're only supposed to be in there for a certain amount of time. And then they get out and usually go to live with a sponsor. So that's usually what happens. Sometimes it's a family member. Sometimes it'll just be, folks someone else knows, maybe like a pastor of a church or someone. In terms of family separation itself, there's been a lot of lawsuits. Raíces has had a lot of lawsuits and reunited a bunch of people. But of course, like not everyone has been reunited. So I think maybe there's some suits that are still going on with that, or folks that are still trying to be reunited. I see cases all the time of folks, who were reunited, but we're still trying to fight their asylum case, trying to get folks also like social services, therapy, all of that. So yeah, I don't know a ton about that, but I think folks are still addressing it. I'm trying to think about organizations that are working on that specifically. I think a lot of legal services organizations, I wonder too, El Charlado might have done or might be doing some stuff on that. They work at the border and do a lot of really great work to support refugees and folks stuck over there, and often try to help folks who are trying to get like back into the US, or I think sometimes who got separated.
And we have a question from Harriet Friedman, which is referencing, I think, Robert Woodward or somebody Woodward.
That is me.
Rabbi Woodward.
What's that?
Rabbi.
Rabbi. Oh, Rabbi Woodward. I thought you were like going back into the annals of. So what can be
Bob
done?
Woodward. Yeah.
What can be done to make the lands that people are leaving more hospitable to its citizens so that immigration is not a life emergency?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'm
It's not
definitely
really
not.
your job.
I'm not the expert of it, but I'll share some perspective that I've heard and folks who are doing stuff. I think to start off kind of negatively, there was a lot of promises that the administration was going to do stuff, and there was a lot from Kamala Harris about her doing stuff and a lot of stuff about her going to countries. And I feel like every presidency, I mean, maybe not Trump, though he might have also, folks are always trying to like initiate and start or continue programs in other countries. So people are always trying to like solve the gang problem or, try to help on certain things. I always kind of feel like they're never enough and not really doing much. So I don't know if there's just someone else who needs to not be doing that. Something that I learned a lot about when I was in Guatemala was just about the US's role in a lot of these countries and what happened. Like in Guatemala, the US and the CEO's role in the Civil War, and thousands and millions of people who were killed. And I think a lot of countries that have that, we see it. I look at, I have a lot of clients from Nicaragua, and I've been looking at that situation. And a lot of folks, you'll look at whoever's in power and you can see like a direct connection to the US at some point, like supporting that person. And then, that movement kind of going out. So I think part of it, and I don't know how to do this, but I think the US needs to take more, accountability for what they've done and to address that, and to not just be like, oh, we're going to go in and start some programs and hope that that's good enough, but to actually like try to address stuff and to do it in a way that isn't more harmful. Sorry, that's not much of an answer, but some
Question.
yeah, it's a great question.
Rachel, do you want to read your statement or your comment, or do you want me to read it? So she's referencing, there was a New York Times article earlier this month about unaccompanied minors who are being employed illegally as underage workers. The guardians to whom they were released are demanding that these kids work, and employers are taking advantage of this low-priced labor. That's a comment. I'm sure it's true. I don't know if you have seen it, Liora.
Yeah, I remember seeing it, and it's awful, and we hear about this stuff all the time, and we hear about it both with kids and adults. I mean, the way that we kind of try to address it is through T visas, which again, like immigration law is not the answer to everything, so I'm not saying that that's the way it should be, but I remember when that happened, folks then thinking, okay, is there a way that we can then, get those folks T visas? Maybe they're already in immigration proceedings. But yeah, it is really sad, I think, especially for folks who don't have family members here, and maybe they end up, or folks who end up with family members who take advantage of them. We see that all the time. So yeah, that's a really, really sad thing.
Oh, wait, another Cohen-Fraade, who says there are also states that are currently trying to allow minors to work with less or no parental sign-off, meaning in general or just?
In general, but I've heard some commentary that says that there might possibly be a connection to the article and that issue in the Times, that they're trying to like either lower the age or just make it much easier for minors to work, which would presumably further contribute to this issue. If there are unaccompanied minors, or if they're minors who are with their families who are trying to seek asylum, who do not have the support that they need, and they're trying to make ends meet.
John,
so there are kind of people are trying to roll back child employment laws.
Yes.
Do you want to say anything about kids in need of defense?
Sure. So one of my clients, Liora, you may know of them, is a group called Kids in Need of Defense. And their work is finding pro bono lawyers to provide representation to unaccompanied minors, and to help them to get what you mentioned, which is the special juvenile immigrant status that would let them stay in the US. because they came here as an unaccompanied minor and they're fleeing potential mortal danger. So that's a group that is working very hard. But one of their realities, it goes back to a question I think Rob asked, which is they're estimating they might serve 10% of all the unaccompanied minors, and that's on a good day. And so there's just hundreds of thousands of children who are, being taken advantage of, and there's no protection for them. So, it's a situation that it's horrifying that we as Americans aren't up in arms. We should, but as a country, we're not. It's like it's somebody else's problem.
Yeah, Kind is great. They do amazing work.
Well, it's 8:44, and even though it's earlier where you are, Liora, we don't want to overstay our welcome with you. And I really appreciate it. This was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. I learned a lot, and I'm also, now I have a picture of what you do, who you are and what you do down there in Texas, and how important it is. And really, I would like to say it's holy work. I'm not a rabbi or anything, but you're helping to save people's lives and dignity. And is there anything more important than that? I don't think so. So again, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your time, and did a great job.
Oh, thank you. I will say one other thing that helps us do the work is like folks like you all. I'm the only lawyer in like my direct family, but I feel like the support from them and folks in the community, that also makes a really big difference in doing the work. And like everyone's doing important work in their own sphere. So it all intersects.
Great. Well, if there are things that you think we need to know, get in touch. I mean, if there are things that we need to be doing, things to sign, comments to send, etc. This problem's unfortunately not going to go away anytime soon, and there's always going to be work to be done. And we want to come behind you and help you do what you're doing.
No, thank you. Yeah, the comment, I think it is Monday. I think it's usually at like midnight, though I could be wrong. Maybe it's 12 p.m. But yeah, it should be the link in the PowerPoint, the page on Biden. I included a little link. So folks, you don't have to know anything about immigration law. You can just go on and like vent basically if you want to. Also, there's sample stuff for stuff. So you could just use their sample.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you again. Thanks so much for coming, everybody.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.